Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Warner, no. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Rubio, aye.
Okay. On this vote, the yeas are 23, the nays are 70. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to.
President,
Majority Leader?
I have two requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of majority and minority leaders. Senate's not in order.
Duly noted.
I ask unanimous consent the remaining votes be 10 minutes in length.
Is there an objection? Without objection. Go ahead and read it. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on calendar number 165, H.R. 3877, an act to amend the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985, and so forth, and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on H.R. 3877, an act to amend the Balanced Budget Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985 to establish a congressional budget for fiscal years 2020 and 2021, to temporarily suspend the debt limit, and for other purpose shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Brasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown, Burr, Capito, Cardin, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Kramer, Duckworth, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Hoeven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Jones, Kennedy, King, Leahy, Markey, McConnell, McSally, Moran, Murray, Perdue, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Rounds, Schumer, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Smith, Sullivan, Thune, Udall, Van Hollen, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden, and Young. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Brasso, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Blackburn, Braun, Carper, Cruz, Daines, Enzi, Fisher, Gardner, Langford, Lee, Manchin, Paul, Risch, Romney, Rubio, Sass, Tester, Tillis, and Toomey. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Okay.
Just read this. Oh. Are there any members in the chamber that are wishing to vote or change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 67, the nays are 27. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn have voted in the affirmative. The motion is agreed to. Okay, second. Under the previous order, all cloture time is expired. The clerk will read the title of the bill for the third time.
Calendar number 165, H.R. 3877, Act to amend the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985 and so forth, and for other purposes.
The questions on passage of the bill? Yeas and nays? Is there a second? Appears to be. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin. Gotcha. I do. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal. Brown. Mr. Brown. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker. Peters. Sir, thank you. Awesome. Thank you. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Wyden, Rosen, Cruz, no. Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines. No? Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Inze, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, yes, sir. Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson. Gotcha. Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Ms. Fisher? Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Casey, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Kramer, Crapo, Ernst, Feinstein, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Jones, Kane, King, McConnell, McSally, Menendez, Merkley, Moran, Murphy, Murray, Purdue, Peters, Portman, Reed, Rosen, Rounds, Schatz, Shaheen, Shelby, Cinema, Smith, Stabenow, Thune, Udall, Van Hollen, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden, and Young. Mr. Langford? Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Senators voting. Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Senators voting in the negative. Bennett, Blackburn, Braun, Cassidy, Cotton, Cruz, Daines, Enzi, Fisher, Gardner, Hawley, Johnson, Kennedy, Klobuchar, Langford, Lee, Manchin, Paul, Romney, Rubio, Scott of South Carolina, Tester, Tillis, and Toomey. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. I did. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Sass, no. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. bill is passed.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 67, the nays are 28, and the bill is passed. The senator from Texas.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Madam President,
The senator
Madam President,
from
the
Texas.
Senate's not in order.
The Senate will be in order. The Senate will be in order. The senator from Texas.
Madam President, when the Senate gavels out at the end of this day, members will head home for the August work period to spend time with our constituents and family. I, for one, am eager to get back home to Texas and spend time with folks in about every region of my state. I have the honor of representing roughly 28 million people, and it takes a little bit of time and effort to get around the state, but I'm looking forward to it. I'll have the chance to highlight some of the work that we've been doing here in Washington, and yes, hear from my constituents, my fellow Texans, on what they care most about, what they agree with, what they disagree with, and everything in between. With the passage of this bipartisan budget deal, we've now taken care of our final piece of business for this work period. The funding agreement we just passed will provide stability for our nation through 2020 and deliver on some of the administration's key priorities. It's been the result of extensive negotiations between President Trump and Speaker Pelosi and represents a compromise between two sides that typically don't agree on much. And yes, compromise is still not a dirty word. It's the only way things get done around here. But obviously, this agreement is not perfect. That's the nature of compromise and the hallmark of responsible governing. By passing this funding agreement, we are avoiding the possibility of government shutdown again this fall. Instead, it provides us the time and space for wide-ranging debate about our government's spending habits. As our national deficit continues to grow, that could not be more critical. I was glad to see that through the President's tough negotiations, it prevents 30 poison pills or policy riders from reaching the President's desk. It's no secret that our friends across the aisle have tried their best to eliminate the Hyde Amendment, which since 1976 has defined a consensus that no taxpayer funds be provided for abortions. That argument is over until 2020. We also know there will be no Green Deal done, no undoing of the President's regulatory reform through the back door. Most importantly, though, this funding agreement invests in our military. If there is one priority for what we ought to be doing here as elected representatives in the federal government, it is provide for the common defense and for our national security. This funding agreement provides the Pentagon the predictability and flexibility they need in order to keep our country safe today and tomorrow. A predictable and steady budget gives our military leaders the ability to plan for the future, and it allows them to invest in the innovative and cutting-edge tools our service members need and ensure that when the call comes, we are ready. I was proud to support this funding agreement, and I'm glad it's now headed to the White House for the President's signature. Madam President, on another matter, over the last few months, I've spoken at length on the Senate floor about a bill I introduced earlier this year to reauthorize the Debbie Smith Act, legislation to help us end the nationwide rape kit backlog. This legislation carries the name of a fierce and courageous woman, a sexual assault survivor whose advocacy was born of her personal experience. 3 decades ago, Debbie Smith was abducted from her home and taken to a wooded area where she was robbed and raped by an unknown attacker. She reported the crime to police and went to the emergency room for a forensic exam. But because of the rape kit backlog, she had to wait 6.5 years before finally receiving the call that her attacker had been identified through a DNA test. During that time, she lived in constant fear, wondering who he was, where he was, and whether he would return to hurt her again. Identifying offenders through DNA evidence is critical to providing not only justice, but peace of mind for those assaulted, and delivering justice to victims, and yes, even exonerating the innocent. The power of DNA testing is such that it can essentially rule out people from being the potential, being the alleged assailant or the actual assailant. So this is really important for a number of reasons. And sharing this information across state lines through the federal system can help us identify repeat offenders who would otherwise go undetected. Knowing the potential impact, Debbie became one of our nation's most vocal advocates for eliminating rape kit backlogs, including this reprehensible rape kit backlog that I've been speaking about. In 2004, a bill that carries her name was signed into law to help local and state crime labs partner with federal law enforcement to receive resources to end the federal DNA evidence backlog. It is because of the Debbie Smith Act that more than $1 billion has been provided to forensic labs across the country. Since 2005, more than 860,000 DNA cases have been processed, accounting for 43% of all forensic profiles in the FBI's DNA database. The Debbie Smith Act has also been central in eliminating the rape kit backlog in my home state of Texas, which had reached the point of more than 20,000 untested kits at one point earlier this decade. As I said at the beginning, I introduced the Debbie Smith Act of 2019 to reauthorize this important funding stream that supports the auditing, testing, and sharing of DNA evidence so we can eliminate that backlog and ensure that it will not grow again in the future. The benefits of continuing the programs created under the original Debbie Smith Act cannot be overstated, and we must get this important legislation to the President's desk before it expires at the end of September. Since it was first enacted in 2004, the Debbie Smith Act has never lapsed or expired, and there's no excuse for allowing it to expire or lapse this year. This bill is not controversial, it's not partisan, and it's not divisive. In fact, when it came to the Senate floor, not a single senator voted against it. But since we passed the legislation in May, the House of Representatives has sat on its hands and has done nothing. After repeated requests from myself, our other colleagues, and countless victims advocates, Speaker Pelosi has refused to bring the Debbie Smith Act up for a vote. Earlier this year, the Fraternal Order of Police, which represents more than 348,000 members, sent a letter to Speaker Pelosi and Leader McCarthy urging the House to move this legislation. We also heard from the National District Attorneys Association, RAIN, the Sergeants Benevolent Association, and several other law enforcement and victims' rights groups who are fully supportive of this legislation. All of us are ready for the House to act. I urge Speaker Pelosi to take up the Debbie Smith Act once the House returns to Washington in September and before it expires or lapses. It is simply unconscionable to let unrelated partisan bickering stop a bill that brings justice to victims.
Madam President.
The senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I want to compliment the leadership in being able to come together on a budget agreement. This was a good day for the United States Senate, good day for Congress, and good day for the American people. We now have predictable spending caps, not only for the fiscal year that begins October 1, but for the following year. So this is good news.